So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on ScenarioMIP. Welcome on behalf of not only me, but also Claudia Tebaldi and Detlef van Vuuren. We're the co-chairs of ScenarioMIP and are going to, we've all put this presentation together. Detlef and I are going to share the actual presenting. I'm first going to talk just briefly about what is ScenarioMIP in the first place, and what did it do in the previous round of Earth System Model Simulations, or CMIP6. And then I will turn it over to Detlef for the main topic today, which is the start that we've made on developing and identifying scenarios to be run in CMIP7. So let's start with what is ScenarioMIP. Next slide, Detlef.
Oh, I have to try and sorry about that.
There we go. Back one. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So ScenarioMIP is a model intercomparison project, right? That's the MIP part that identifies and coordinates Earth system model simulations of plausible future emissions and land use scenarios. And it's part of CMIP, the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, which is a WCRP activity, and it's kind of an umbrella for a large number of individual MIPs that are focused on specific topics. I'm showing here the diagram from CMIP6, the last phase of the CMIP project. And you can see that there's MIPs that are focused on everything from oceans to clouds to aerosols, carbon cycle, land use, geoengineering, all kinds of topics. And one of those topics is scenarios. And ScenarioMIP coordinates that particular model intercomparison project. So it's one of many MIPs that make up CMIP. It's run currently by a 14-member scientific steering committee, and that leadership actually is being expanded right now in ways that Detlef will describe. So on the next slide, the goals for ScenarioMIP are to run scenarios in Earth system models that would achieve potentially two things. First is to facilitate research that needs climate simulations of plausible scenarios as input. So that's typically integrated research that combines climate model runs, climate science topics, with impacts or mitigation to address policy relevant questions. This you can think of as a service oriented goal. It's the climate model simulations from ScenarioMIP are of service to other research communities for them to address their research questions. A second kind of goal is to directly address particular science questions with the ScenarioMIP simulations. And this is done often in collaboration with other scientific MIPs, for example, to address questions about land use, effects on climate, or aerosols, or things like that. So given those goals, we have a set of criteria for selecting or identifying scenarios to be run by Earth system models. First, consistent with this service role, that they're useful to other climate change research communities. Second, consistent with our other goal, that they might be important to addressing a targeted scientific question. Third, that they may be relevant to policy, or that means as well support research that is relevant to policy. And fourth, in some cases, it is useful to provide continuity with previous CMIP phases, to run simulations that are similar to those that were run in previous phases to provide continuity in the research literature. Okay, so given those criteria, what did ScenarioMIP decide to run last time around in CMIP6? In the end, what was decided on in CMIP6 was 8 different emissions and concentration scenarios that were produced with integrated assessment models. And they're shown here in the bold colors. The colored lines are the ScenarioMIP scenarios. The gray lines in the back are the scenarios in the literature at the time that CMIP6 was put together. And I'm showing these in terms of radiative forcing for each of these scenarios that combines the effects of all the gases. And you see that these 8 scenarios span a wide range of futures, from very high scenario at the top to very low scenarios at the bottom that are consistent with the Paris Agreement goals of 1.5 or 2 degree targets. And there are a number of scenarios in between, including one that has a kind of substantial peak and decline or overshoot scenario in terms of radiative forcing. 8 scenarios is a lot to run. So these were separated into 2 tiers by priority. And so I'm listing all the scenarios here using this convention that the first number in the name is the number of the SSP, and the second number is the radiative forcing that's achieved at the end of the century. So in the first tier, we have 3 scenarios that reach 8.5, 4.5, and 2.6 watts per meter squared by the end of the century. These were chosen to cover a wide range of outcomes and therefore serve a wide range of needs for impact and mitigation analysis. And they were also chosen to be consistent with the previous generation of Earth system model runs for CMIP5, which had similar scenarios. It also includes SSP 3-7, which is another relatively high scenario that was chosen in large part to be able to address targeted questions about land use and aerosols, since it has a lot of both of those in that scenario. And in tier 2, we had another kind of high, medium, low trio that filled in gaps between the tier 1 scenarios. And that also included the SSP1 1.9 scenario that was intended specifically to be consistent with the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees C. And the 8th scenario was the overshoot scenario I pointed out. That was designed to address science questions about declining forcing. And finally, there was the additional request made to modeling groups to do a large ensemble of runs for one of the scenarios and to run long-term extensions to 2300 for several of these. So with these scenarios defined, they were then run by Earth system models. Earth system modeling groups were free to choose to participate in the model intercomparison by running all of these or some of them, whatever they thought they were able to do. About 30 models ran the tier 1 scenarios, and here you see just a couple variables from these simulations plotted: global average temperature on the left and global average precipitation on the right for the 4 tier 1 scenarios, plus the SSP1 1.9 scenario. And these were the 5 that were assessed by IPCC in AR6 in the Working Group 1 report. And of course, as a reminder, there's many other variables available from the Earth system model runs, gridded climate variables of all kinds. We're just showing a couple of global average outcomes here as an example, a representation of a much bigger set of climate model output. So that's what ScenarioMIP is and what it did the last time around. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Detlef to talk about current scenario MIP work and the road to CMIP7.
Thank you, Brian. And so, yeah, the starting point for CMIP7 is that the scenario MIP runs in CMIP6 have been very successful. And, literally thousands of papers have used the outcomes of the climate model runs from CMIP6, both in terms of impact research or in terms of analysis of climate characteristics. And so there's a lot of science done on the basis of the scenario MIP runs. But they also were the foundation of major parts of the IPCC assessment. And so choosing, as we expect a similar role of CMIP7 in the scenario MIP scenarios, I think it's important to make the right choice in terms of the selection of scenarios. And so the CMIP panel asked the co-chairs of the previous round to continue this exercise. And so we have started to set up CMIP7. And I think we have to realize that there are at least 3 important goals for the scenarios that are used for CMIP7. So first of all, the scenarios that we run support climate research. As I emphasized, both the impact community and the climate community itself uses these scenarios. Secondly, there's an important service from these scenarios for the impact and mitigation research. And so there's a lot of impact research that cannot be done if we don't have scenarios expanding a wide range of possible outcomes, exploring, for instance, also the outcomes of unsuccessful climate policy. And so there's a surface component to the runs that we do with scenario MIP. And there's also a policy component by exploring different the full range of possible outcomes. We directly and indirectly via IPCC support climate policy. What we have also done is that we more or less asked most of the people that were in the previous scientific steering committee to stay on as well. But there is a call also to further broaden the scientific steering committee. And that's mostly because we want to increase the geographical representation and we want to increase the representation of some of the research areas, especially with respect to impact research and with respect to the representation of different Earth system modeling teams. We feel that the scientific steering committee can be more representative. And so we have at the moment a call for people to candidate themselves. And at some point we will make a selection to broaden the scientific steering committee and especially increase the geographical representation. So in starting the exercise, we had a kickoff meeting in Reading, which was June this year, and which was organized well by the CMIP support office. And we asked people from ScenarioMIP, obviously, to be present, but we also asked participants of other CMIPs to be there from system modeling centers. And we also organized a survey before the meeting to gather input from a wide community in preparation of the meeting. And the reason why we would like other MIPs to be there is that we also previously tried to organize some efficiency in the scenario runs. And so if, for instance, we would like to research the impact of aerosols in CMIP, we ensured that there was a scenario in ScenarioMIP and then a scenario in CMIP that would be specifically different in terms of aerosol forcing. And so we thought it was useful to see whether we could organize something like that again. And at the meeting, there were in total almost 80 participants and almost 40 people were in person there. And the goals were to understand the different needs for ScenarioMIP in the next round, to understand the simulations that are run in the other MIPs, so maybe to make sure that we can coordinate the experimental designs related to scenarios, to start thinking of scenario selection, and especially we thought it was important to think of criteria, but if the meeting was successful, we also hoped to really start with scenario design, and to also develop a process of how to select scenarios. We had a meeting. There were lots of discussions. It was a meeting of 3 days, and some important outcomes were that, first of all, clearly the new runs need to be relevant for AR7. They also need to somehow be relevant for the stocktake process that will take place in the period as well, in 2028. We also realized that there's an important role for ScenarioMIP scenarios to be relevant for IPCC, and that at this point of time, we don't know exactly the timing of the IPCC exercise. And therefore, this comes back later, but it is a bit difficult now to decide exactly how the timing of ScenarioMIP should look like if we don't know the timing of IPCC. We also discussed a number of scenarios, and here there are two competing interests. So first of all, some of the system modeling teams have indicated that they don't want too many scenarios simply because of the burden in terms of model runs. And at the same time, we want enough scenarios to understand the possible futures with respect to climate and to explore different policy initiatives. What we thought was really important at the meeting with you there is that we wanted to span the range of plausible scenarios. And that means that we have to assess what plausible scenarios are. And clearly they need to be policy relevant as well, which means to cover the Paris Agreement. But we also found it important for ScenarioMIP to not look into scenarios that are simply physically not possible. I'll come back to that as well. And there was a discussion about how to potentially run scenarios. In CMIP6, nearly all scenarios were run in concentration-driven mode. There's a strong interest to start running scenarios in emission-driven mode. That gives a much better representation of the uncertainty and uses the Earth system models in a way that is simply better representing their strengths. But it creates obviously also a much wider range of outcomes. It's something that we need to realize. Actually, at the meeting, I think we were much more successful than we originally thought, and we were able to make a strawman proposal for the selection of scenarios. In this stage, this is a strawman proposal. We would like in the coming half year or so with the community to discuss this strawman proposal and see whether changes need to be made. But the first scenario that people felt relevant to run would be a scenario that is representative of current policies. And means that with the integrated assessment modeling community would like to find out what that scenario would mean. But we expect that scenario maybe to be somewhere around 4.5 per square meter, somewhere in the order of 2.5 to 3 degrees warming. Then we thought it is really important to also have a scenario that explores the high range of possible climate change. And obviously, especially for impact research, this is really important. You all probably have seen the discussion about RCP 8.5 and how relevant that still is. And we believe that indeed emissions as high as in RCP 8.5 have increasingly become implausible. But at the same time, the question is, what is then the high range? And we can expect that population growth could be higher than expected. We can expect that possibly climate policy is less successful in certain political developments. We can also expect maybe that technology development might be slower than expected. And so we can think of a high emission scenario, which might not be as high as RCP 8.5, but maybe comes out where the 7 watts per square meter or the 6 watts per square meter scenarios currently are. The scenario, then we felt it's really important also to explore scenarios at the low end. These are scenarios that directly speak to the Paris Agreement. And here we had an important discussion as well, which is how plausible are scenarios going to 1.5 degrees. And we discussed that, and we felt actually that there are still scenarios possible that would reach that goal. Certainly scenarios maybe that would emphasize methane reductions much more than we have explored in the past. And so that meant that in the Strawman proposal, we would like to include a scenario that goes directly to 1.5 degrees. We also would like to contrast that with a scenario that is first going higher and then via overshoot would reach 1.5 degrees. Obviously, that scenario needs to be more negative in the second half of the century to come back to a low temperature. And we also want to have a scenario that is relevant for well below 2 degrees. And so this would be then 3 scenarios that represent the Paris Agreement. There are some scientific questions here as well. So first of all, can we design a scenario that goes that would still remain below 1.5 degrees? So we would like the integrated assessment modeling community to look into this. We also want to know how much scenarios need to be different to be relevant for Earth system model runs. And so there's a question of resolution that needs to be solved. So here too, there are still some open questions that need to be answered before we can finalize this Strawman proposal. We also would like to extend the scenarios. On the high end, obviously, you would like to extend that scenario with some high level of climate change and into long-term dynamics of, for instance, sea level rise. On the low end, we would like to see an extension of scenarios as well, which could be a continuation of the level of carbon dioxide removal or scenarios that would stabilize warming at a certain level. And there was some discussion on whether the scenarios actually themselves should end in 2020, 2125, and then the extension would start from that period, or whether we would still continue to work with 2100 scenarios. And so there's now a request to the integrated assessment modeling community to think of the question, can they now model maybe to 2125? There were also some issues that we could not discuss in detail yet at the meeting. For instance, in the last round of scenarios, we also had deliberately a scenario with a relatively high level of aerosol emissions. Most of the other scenarios had relatively low aerosol emissions as a result of either climate policy or air pollution policy. And we had to think now, we still have to think how to possibly bring that into the current scheme. We also didn't discuss yet the size of the ensembles and which of the scenarios maybe would be suitable for a larger set of ensembles. We did not discuss in detail the naming yet. If we're going to run scenarios in emissions driven mode, they will come out at a wider range of temperature outcomes, a much wider range of radial forcing outcomes. So maybe the naming needs to be quite different from what they were previously. We also noted that with the last CMIP7 naming, the fact that we included the SSP names in the scenarios run by the Earth system models, it turned out to be somewhat confusing. People interpreted the SSP name as also meaning that those scenarios can only be used with the socioeconomic assumptions of that SSP. And so we wanted to change the naming anyway. So there will be a new name, a set of namings, which might even be as simple as low, high, but we have to discuss that. Yeah, and then also there might still be a scenario that was not shown in this scheme yet, but that would start from the middle scenario and would only branch off very late to explore the impact of delayed policy. So I already indicated that we currently are extending the SSC a little bit. We want to not go over 20 members in the SSC to make it still effective. But we want to also have an extended scenario MIP, and that would be an advisory group that would help the scientific steering group commission to make decisions. And so we have now a call both for the advisory group and the SSC for people to candidate themselves. In the discussion of the Stormont proposal, at several places I indicated that there are open questions. And so we have also now put into place 4 different task forces that would explore the best formulation of the low scenarios, and especially how deep methane reduction could play a role in those low scenarios. We have installed a second task force that would look at the middle scenario where it would come out, but also at the high end, what would be a plausible high-end scenario given high population growth and low technology development, for instance. Then the third task force would look into the extensions and make proposals for the extensions. And the last task force should think about how to best represent carbon dioxide representation in that interaction between Earth system models and integrated assessment models. And so if we are going to run in emission-driven mode, how are we going to give that information from the IEMs to the Earth system models? Do we provide, for instance, the area that is going to be used for bioenergy that is used in CCS, or the area that is used for afforestation? That discussion will be held in that task force. Yeah, we started to discuss the timeline of the scenario MIP 12, and how far in the development of a final proposal. That was relatively easy. We had the Reading meeting. We thought it was really important to be inclusive in terms of the process and ensure that there are many moments in time that scientific people that are using these scenarios could express their opinion on scenario selection. And so the first moment for that is actually this webinar, where we indicate the process that we have designed in our original Stormont proposal. We would like to further extend that Stormont proposal, and by the end of September and early October, come with the final proposal that we would then put out for review to get comments, so that we can formulate a final proposal early next year. Again, ask for comments, and then somewhere in early spring, submit that both to GMD and ask for approval from ESMO. The second timeline is a little bit less clear, and this depends partly on the IPCC planning. It also depends on how optimistic or pessimistic we are in terms of finalizing certain steps. And we realize that in the process, there are a few steps that we have to do. So first of all, we have to write the proposal for the scenarios that are going to be run. Then there's a need for integrated assessment model runs. That would be the input into the process of the Earth system model runs. There's a need for harmonization of the historical forcing data with the future, the forcing data for the future. And then obviously there needs to be time for Earth system models to run this information and provide that output and make it available. And the right part of this slide indicates that in 2028 there will be this global stocktake process, and we expect that IPCC is going to do some form of assessment as input to the global stocktake process. We don't expect that that will be the assessment, the seventh assessment report. We expect that to be published after the global stocktake. And the question is, can we design something that is still possibly ending before the global stocktake, or do we actually directly aim for the final assessment report? And this scheme, we'd have designed something that would still be in time for the global stocktake report, the global stocktake. But yeah, it's relatively optimistic. And so one task of ScenarioMIP, again, in the next half year, is to find out the final decision on the timing of IPCC, but also to discuss with integrated assessment modeling community and the system modeling community how realistic a time schedule as indicated on this graph is. And maybe the alternative is to do something intermediate and have some scenarios being on a faster time track and some other scenarios being on a slower time track. At this point of time, we would like to open up and ask you to whether you still have questions, whether you have comments, whether you feel that we are going in the right direction. And therefore, I would like to hand over back to Eleanor, I guess.
Thanks very much, Detlef. Okay, so we've got the Slido, we've got some questions there waiting, but if anyone would like to answer, ask a question in person as such, please just put up your hand. Maybe while people are having a think, Beth, do you want to pull off a couple of the questions we've got on Slido?
Yeah, sure. So we've got one from Chris Wells asking about how socioeconomic baseline conditions are going to be considered. They seemed really key to the SSPs, but they're not in the straw man. And how is that going to be then coordinated through the IAMs?
Yeah, so should I answer that, Brian? Last time, we had the SSP naming in the scenarios, but we realized that for most of the climate models, some of the socioeconomic conditions are of secondary importance, and the forcing from greenhouse gases, from air pollutants, and from land use are much more important. And so the exception might be on the low side, where land use and air pollution emissions might be important as well. And so we would like to, first of all, and that was also a previous time, to, if we can, decouple the climate futures from the socioeconomic development, and then maybe later on think how they are potentially coupled. So in this proposal, you see the same idea, that in principle, we would like to create scenarios that are relevant to find out the climate futures, and then allow the integrated assessment modeling community later on to think how that relates to different socioeconomic futures. Having said so, in the scenarios that we create with the integrated assessment models, there will be underlying socioeconomic assumptions. And at the moment, actually, those are being updated. So there is a process where we are updating both the population, the GDP, and the energy and land use components of the SSPs.
We've still not got any hands up, so Beth, I think you can continue with the Slido.
Yeah, sure. There's another one from Ranjini Swaminathan asking, is there a way to design scenarios to be able to study low likelihood, high impact events or even tipping points, and whether this is even possible?
I can take that if you want. So first of all, I want to underline once again that ScenarioMIP wants to run plausible scenarios. So the only way we can start to address this kind of question is by considering the highest plausible scenario that can be conceived and ask climate models to run it. So in our current proposal, we have a high scenario. We still have an open question about how high that would be, but we plan to explore that and then include it in our protocol. Now, the question of exploring tipping points is more of a question for the climate modeling community, as in current simulations, our climate models don't represent tipping points. So that is something that we may help the climate model community to explore by providing this high scenario and possibly also its continuation beyond 2100. But we cannot ensure that just by doing that, we will see tipping points.
Beth, I think you can keep going.
So Another question on whether will there be a net zero by end of century scenario?
So the on the slides that I have, we indicated that we would like to have at least 2 scenarios that are relevant for 1.5 degrees, and also one for well below 2. That scenario might be relatively close already to end of century net zero in terms of total greenhouse gases. We are considering also having a scenario that was not on the slide, which would branch off from the middle scenario relatively late. So yes, there would be scenarios that are relatively close to that.
And then another question from Lars, asking about isn't it important to not only look at end of century, but also at kind of the 40s and the 50s, as that's when most of the climate damage is likely to happen?
Well, on that, I can say that, of course, the analysis that these runs will support can be focused, anywhere along this timeline, right? So the ScenarioMIP simulations will produce climate model output for scenarios that stretch all the way from today till the end of the century. And so analysis can be focused in the 40s and 50s or second half of the century or whatever researchers may like to do. So it should be flexible in that way.
Cool, thank you. There's a question on whether a global warming level approach would be better for adaptation planning than just relying on a few CMIP7 simulations.
I don't think necessarily those are 2 different approaches. I think with running these scenarios, you will also have temperature levels somewhere during those projections, which can be used to calculate impacts at those particular global warming levels. So I think in principle, those approaches can be combined with each other. And the nice thing about running them in the way that we propose is that we have somewhat plausible trajectories of getting to those global warming levels.
Cool. There's a question from Irina Melnikova asking if emission mode will be applied for CO2 only or also for other greenhouse gases.
I think it's a very good question. So we were mostly thinking about CO2 when we were discussing the emission mode. Depending on the models for some other greenhouse gases, this might be more complex because they also would need to represent the atmospheric chemistry. So this is something that we might want to discuss a bit more in detail. In any case, we want to make also the option of running things in concentration mode available. We know that not all the climate modeling teams have the option to run in emission mode. So also for CO2, and certainly also for the other gases, we make the option to run things in a concentration mode available as a secondary option.
So going back kind of to the questions of kind of plausibility of scenarios, Torben's asked at the high end of scenarios are for good reason they're excluded, but at the low end it seems everything is still considered plausible, and is that really realistic?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think we all have our opinions of what is politically realistic. We wanted to concentrate mostly on the question what is tactically still possible, and we had a very serious discussion of whether we felt that 1.5 degrees was still possible. Obviously, when these scenarios come out and they are used in AR7, we are in 2028 or 2030, and so it means that climate policy can only start at the very best in the second half of the 2020s, which means that we again would have lost a period of climate action, which means that for CO2 we will end up higher than some of the CMIP6 scenarios. So the question was, is it still possible to consider 1.5 degree scenarios? Thinking of the possibilities to strengthen methane, in the end gave us the answer, yes, we think that it is still plausible under certain conditions, certainly in combination with the fact that these scenarios are extremely policy relevant, given the Paris Agreement. And so we would like to see now, and that's a question to the integrated assessment modeling community, can you provide us with scenarios that have a relatively late start of climate policy, but then would be so stringent on both CO2 and methane that they would remain below 1.5. That's the most ambitious scenario, but at the same time we would like to contrast that with a scenario that is slower, but via negative emissions would have come back to 1.5 with an overshoot scenario. So yes, I think it's a very good question, but at this point of time, we felt that this was still plausible enough, also in light of the policy relevance.
We also have a task force that is tasked to explore exactly this question. So,
yeah.
There's a question asking, is it shared that the lowest scenario should incorporate SDGs beyond climate? Could SSP 1 to 1.9 equivalent scenarios be encouraged, for example, through Tier 1 or similar?
Yes, this was also part of the discussions. And so, as far as we can, this is a logical additional assumption to add to those scenarios. I think the world doesn't get much better if we would have a very stringent climate policy scenario, but miss on most of the SDGs. Yeah, that might have consequences for the amount of, for some of the land-based mitigation assumptions that we make. They should not be going excessive, but it's something that we have to see how we can build that in.
You mentioned those land-based assumptions, so there's a couple of questions asking about the kind of the feasibility assessment of these. So will the updating of baseline assumptions include a feasibility assessment, in particular with reference to the rates of LUC for CDR delivery, and also how you would stress test the LULC feasibility in version 2?
Should I start with that? And if people want to. So there are a few elements to this. So first of all, by running them in emission mode, we indirectly also get a feasibility test, because these scenarios are not only run by IAM models, but then later on by Earth system models. And given the fact that Earth system models possibly have a better representation of some of the carbon cycle dynamics, there's a feasibility test as part of ScenarioMIP, where we would find out whether they're reproduced in a certain way. Yeah, and on the land use mitigation side, so we have seen that in the early 2010s or so, in response to the question to the Paris Agreement, many IAMs have started to produce scenarios which were quite aggressive on land use mitigation, simply to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. In the last few years, we have also seen that that in general, models have started to be a bit more cautious in this area and try to explore other ways to go to low emission levels. So this concern about what is feasible is an important discussion in the integrated system modeling literature, and we will take that into account. But maybe if Claudia and Brian want to add.
I would just add that part of the idea for the low scenario or scenarios in the ScenarioMIP design is what is the lowest scenario that is considered plausible or feasible? So that's a question that will be thought about both at this early stage when this is discussed in the task force, but maybe not yet doing integrated assessment model runs. But it will also be a very present topic when integrated assessment model runs begin to be done, because that's one of the criteria for this low scenario. And of course, you know, there become lots of different perspectives to take into account on what is plausibility, but at least the best that can be done is the aim for doing this for the low scenario.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions asking maybe to explain further the idea behind decoupling the SSPs and the SSP and the RCPs. And is there any plans in the future of incorporating the concept of shared climate policy assumptions as well?
And so on the in the research of the mitigation community and also in the research of the impact community, and the assumptions on socioeconomic development and also on policies, and therefore the shared policy assumptions are critical. We know that the cost of reaching certain targets depends strongly on socioeconomic assumptions, and also the climate damage depends strongly on the ability of society to adapt to climate change. On the climate modeling side, this is a less important theme. There are the most dominant factors of the greenhouse gas concentrations, and indirectly there's also some impact of socioeconomic development given land use and aerosol emissions. And so already in CMIP6, our idea was to decouple the SSPs and RCPs, and so allow people to use the outcomes of different climate model runs in combination with different SSPs, simply to not have the Earth system models having to run the full matrix of options of SSPs and RCP combinations. And that's what we want to, that idea is what we want to extend. And so the idea of SSPs and shared policy assumptions will come fully back once we have these climate model runs and we start to use them in the impact community and in the mitigation community. But for now, in this stage, it's a bit less important. Yeah, and for those purposes in the IAM community and in the IAV community, I think it is interesting to think a bit further how we can develop the shared policy assumptions also, for instance, for adaptation.
I want to just add that it was an unfortunate choice to label our scenarios in CMIP6 as SSP X, Y point Z, because that way we created and perpetrated this idea that the actual SSP used to produce, emissions and land use forcings by the IAM for that scenario was integral to the outcomes of the climate model itself, and that's not the case. Like Detlef was saying, it was not feasible to ask a climate model to run the same radiative forcing scenario that was developed by using different SSPs. So we had to choose one, and we made the mistake of actually labeling the actual output of the climate model by the SSP used. But the assumption is that it is not critical to the climate model outcome. And it becomes critical, like Detlef was saying, when you a posteriori want to analyze, adaptation, impacts and adaptation outcomes when you want to actually choose an SSP to match climate model output too. So I hope this becomes a little clearer.
Thank you.
Not to beat a dead horse here, but I sympathize with the question because it is confusing. The point of the SSP RCP matrix is to integrate SSPs and RCPs, and that remains true. It's just that we're trying to avoid the impression that you can integrate these two only in a very restricted way. You can only say in an SSP2 4.5 climate model simulation, you can only use that with SSP2 socioeconomic assumptions. That's not the case. You can use it with other socioeconomic assumptions as well. So it's a more flexible, we want to promote a more flexible way to integrate the two. But the overall goal still is integration.
Great, thanks. There's a couple of questions on sort of quantification and consultation on the scenarios. So there's one asking if the CMIP7 scenarios will be quantified by several teams, and another more specifically asking if there'll be consultation with scientists from India about the economic scenarios, as there was potentially some issues with the previous ones.
Yeah, so in the selection of the scenarios now, as I presented, we have built in several moments where we would like to ask the community to respond to the decisions or the proposals that we have made. So yes, we would like to open up a process that is open and allows for consultation. That will also possibly involve the socioeconomic assumptions, but given the previous discussion, that's not the emphasis of the climate model runs. I missed the first part of the question. Can you repeat that again? Because I know that there was also.
So that there was whether the CMIP7 scenarios would be quantified by several different teams.
For sure, for the climate model runs. So we have many climate models that are going to run this. Yes, on the integrated assessment modeling side, it's more than likely that many teams would be interested to be part of the quantification, and so there will be alternative quantifications available. And then we, like the previous time, would select one that would be the one that we propose to be run by the system models.
We're nearing the end, but I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions. So there's a question asking if you've considered representing the carbon cycle uncertainties using ranges of WMGHG concentrations for a given emission scenario.
Well, I think practically speaking, that will be the case in emissions-driven mode. Different Earth system models will be producing different concentrations of CO2, for example, as well as different warming outcomes in the end. So with emissions-driven mode, anyway, I think there won't be a need to provide a concentration range because you'd be providing emissions. I think the question of would we want to, as Detlef said, we would also be making available concentrations so that models could run in concentration-driven mode as well. And I would guess there the point is to not have a range of concentrations, but to have a best estimate. In order to control one aspect of the uncertainty. But the idea of providing a range is, yes, maybe something to consider. I think it would make the Earth system modeling runs complicated, and but worth considering how to incorporate that uncertainty in a concentration-driven mode.
And maybe just one final question then, but possibly a little bit of a tricky one. Chris Wells has said, obviously we can't get it spot on, but how can you deal with the fact that a 1.5 degrees will actually give a range of temperatures, especially in emissions-driven mode?
Yeah, I think it is the fact that we're going to do this emission driven simply is more true to the real uncertainty than how we did it last time. And so it may be simply seen as an advantage that we now have a wider uncertainty. It will have some complications as well in the impact community. They might want to think of how to run this and what that additional uncertainty would mean to them. It might also have complications in the naming. So we can't name these scenarios after their expected temperature or radiative forcing outcome, because that could be totally confusing. Even if the scenario would be designed to go to 1.5, maybe in some models it would come out much higher or much lower in emission-driven mode. So that means that in terms of naming, we also have to think a bit of what would be the best names for this. It will represent a new way of thinking about these outcomes, but I think it is actually a gain that we better represent the true uncertainty here.
And to some degree, to some extent, it's a matter of degree, because we already in CMIP6 and concentration-driven runs have a range of temperature outcomes, right? So SSP 1.9 doesn't always lead to staying below 1.5 degrees. It leads to a range. Now, a emissions-driven scenario intended to be consistent with 1.5 degrees will likely lead to an even wider range. So it's not like we haven't faced this issue before, but it will be bigger. It will be a bigger issue.
Thanks everyone. That's us just coming up to the hour. So what we'll do with any questions that haven't been answered, we will include them in the FAQ on the ScenarioMIP web pages. And later today or tomorrow, we'll also send out make the slides available, and also the recording of today. So those who are in different time zones and weren't able to make it will be able to see it as well. So I'll just hand back to the co-chairs to just finish the webinar.
Yes, we'd like to thank everybody for coming and for your ideas and questions, and to keep an eye out for future review periods and further opportunities for input as we go forward with producing this ScenarioMIP design over the coming months. So thanks again to everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, Eleanor and Elizabeth.